All right, it's 12 o'clock. So let me make sure that everything's recording and we'll go from there. So I just said I've got a coat on because last week I had hat on because I had crazy hair. But then my wife gave me a haircut. I've had worse haircuts. And then today it's absolutely freezing in the gym, so I'm keeping my coat on. So last week when I tried to record on Zoom, it didn't record, so I promised to give everybody the slides and didn't end up giving everybody the slides. So I have made sure that everything is recording on Zoom this week, and hopefully you find it very useful. I will post it again later on, and then you'll be able to just get a link out to go to YouTube with it. All right, so today, the interesting topics for today's talk, you probably saw, are some ones that you've probably had some deliberation with in the past. Hey, Amy. Hey, Karen. It says Amy C, but hey, Karen. So ones you've probably had some conversations about in the past. So it's eating for fat loss. That's number one. Eating for muscle growth. That's number two. And then popular mainstream diets. So they're quite broad topics. So the goal was to try and unpack some of the most common questions that we get about them, how they can work for you, and what we can do about them, basically. So at the end of this, the same idea is true for week to week. The goal is the workshop objective is for you to get something actionable out of this. So even if it's information you've heard before, for me, I always find information super useful, even if it confirms what I'm already thinking. If I've started to doubt, whether creating a calorie deficit actually works for fat loss, if I hear it again from somebody who knows a little bit about it, then, it makes me feel a little bit more solid, and I'm willing to keep going down that path, and any other information like that. So yeah, have a concrete takeaway for something that you can practice, something that you can, overcome, something you can apply to a challenge you're currently having, and try and make it feel a little better. So as I said, this week's topics: eating for fat loss, eating for muscle growth, and popular mainstream diets. So the questions that I got around those topics were, I probably got about 15 questions, and I lumped a handful of them together. So the main one that I thought was really interesting was, what's the easiest diet to do for fat loss? What's the easiest diet to do for fat loss? That'll be interesting to talk about. How to gain muscle as a vegetarian, which is interesting. What's the deal with keto and intermittent fasting? And can I add muscle without gaining fat? So all interesting things. So we'll move on. So the first thing we're going to talk about is nutrition for muscle growth. And I'll start with a simple one. I'll start with a nice one that most people don't necessarily have really strong feelings about. So how to get more, or how to get muscle, or how to grow muscle as a vegetarian. So let's think about where we typically get muscle growth from, or muscle growth support from, is from protein. Now, if I'm a vegetarian, really easy for me to get protein from animal sources. If I don't eat animal products, then I'm probably going to get less protein. So it's a little harder that way. So vegetarians routinely struggle to kind of balance getting enough protein to support muscle growth and repair at the rate that they need. Okay, so what we end up seeing there is, when we train, we create a stress that we need to be able to recover and adapt to. All right, so if I stress myself really hard in the gym, protein is a really important macronutrient that's going to allow me to help me recover, grow bigger muscles, adapt to that stress, and then be able to go back to the gym again later on. So that's why protein's obviously very important, and that's why it's difficult for vegetarians at this point to gain muscle, because they're maybe not getting enough of the protein that they need to support their recovery. So their training might have to change a little bit. So they might not be able to drive themselves quite as hard in the gym, because if they create a stimulus that's too hard for them to recover from, with the amount of protein that they're getting, if they create a stimulus that's too hard for them to recover from, they're actually just going to get burnt out and plateau. So that's why it's difficult, I guess, to surmise it. That's why it's difficult for vegetarians to gain muscle, or to grow muscle, because they don't necessarily have enough to support their recovery. The other side of that is that it's likely easier to overconsume carbohydrates as a vegetarian, because options are plentiful, right? So if you don't eat protein, you still need calories, but now you've only got fat and carbohydrates to eat those calories from. Sorry, I'm just going to quickly make sure that everyone's muted. It's likely easier to overconsume carbohydrates as a vegetarian because options are plentiful for like grains and starches, which still offer energy output, but they don't offer as much for recovery from that stress that you're creating in the gym. As the same amount of calories that if you've got those same amount of calories from protein. So 500 calories worth of rice, predominantly carbohydrates, is not the same, obviously, as 500 calories of chicken or protein, wherever you're going to get your protein from. So it will allow you to create, output energy, but it won't necessarily help you recover as well as protein could. So the science, therefore, is the same. You need protein, regardless of your nutritional choices, whether you're vegetarian or not, vegan or not. You need protein to support muscle growth and recovery. And if you train hard, you likely need more protein than the average person, period. It's just the way it is, okay? So you not only need to be able to eat enough calories, but you need to be able to eat calories from protein, carbohydrates, and fat across the board. So the hard thing for vegetarians to do is get enough protein, because you don't get protein very much from carbohydrates. Obviously, there are some foods that have both fat and carbohydrates and protein all in some mixture or another. So like peanut butter, for example, peanut butter has carbohydrates, it has fat, it has protein in it. Its main macronutrient is fat, right? So eating peanut butter to get enough protein to help you recover, there's not that much protein in it, but there is a bloody large amount of fat in it. So you're likely going to end up over consuming fat without actually bringing your protein levels up enough to help your recovery. Does that make sense? So there's also like protein in spinach, but there's only so much spinach you can eat to get enough protein to be able to get it up there. So to get your protein high enough to help your recovery. So it's probably not dense enough. The protein amount isn't dense enough for the amount of food that you can actually eat. So there's plenty of good sources, obviously, of vegetarian protein. It's all over the internet. So my 2 cents really are the ones that I've, had good experience with in the past: lentils, tempeh, and tofu. If you still need more protein, you're not able to get it through that food or through those foods that you feel comfortable with, protein powders are a great option, supplements or bars. They'll increase your options and your ease of hitting the protein needs. All right. So it just gives you a handful more options, a little bit more flexibility there. But they are supplements. And obviously the word supplement means in addition to. So make sure you're eating as much whole foods to get your protein, carbohydrates, and fat in as possible. All right. So that question came from somebody who I know through the Strong First community, who is a vegetarian, but also trains pretty hard and pretty heavy pretty frequently, but is struggling to recover. He's also in his like 40s, 50s as well. So the later on he gets in his life, the harder it's going to be for him to recover and to grow muscle. So hopefully that helps him answer his question a little bit. So moving on to the next slide, and this is where we kind of start diving in a little bit more to the age-old question that I've always been asked by people is, how do I gain muscle without gaining fat? I'm just going to let that one fester for a second. How do I gain muscle without gaining fat? Because that's like the ideal scenario. That's the perfect thing. Lean muscle makes us look better, feel better, perform better. And ideally, we'd like to not gain excess fat when we're trying to do that. So training, obviously, is a key factor for muscle growth. 3 to 4 sessions of moderate to difficult resistance training each week will provide a stress. So very similar thing to what I just said a minute ago in the vegetarian scenario. The calorie intake then should be thought of not as trying to gain weight or get heavier, but your calorie intake should be thought of as being dedicated to muscle repair, recovery, and growth. Energy will come from those foods that you're eating, but eat foods that are specific to helping you recover from your training stress. So earlier on this week, somebody asked me, I'm trying to gain weight. So I'm eating 4 cookies throughout the day. Should I eat them in the morning or in the evening? And I said, why are we eating cookies? So those cookies are 600, 700 calories extra per day. Try and get 600, 700 calories extra per day of something that's actually useful towards your recovery. The cookies, not that useful towards his recovery. He's training pretty hard, but he wasn't actually getting quite as much out of it as he could be, okay? So the goal there was for him to understand that not all calories are created equal. So 700 calories worth of cookies, refined sugar, grains, is not the same as 700 calories worth of chicken breast or lean meats. One of those things is going to help him recover from his training stress a lot better without actually over consuming calories or doing too many things that he doesn't need to be doing, eating too many things that he doesn't need to be eating. So the hard truth is if those that are looking to gain muscle without gaining fat often look at this as like a bulk. So you've probably heard of it as a bulk. They target simply consuming more calories, regardless of where those calories come from. The truth, however, is that it's all about the quality of the calories that we take in. If you're working diligently in the gym on targeted strength training to cause enough stress that's demanding your body to adapt and recover from it, but you're fueling your body with poor quality protein, refined sugars, and that kind of stuff, like protein bars and cookies at the end of the day, then you likely aren't aiding your recovery, which will lead you to either plateauing or burning out. It's just going to be the way it is. So it's very hard. The person asked me, you know, like, I'm trying to gain weight. And I said to him, like, are you trying to gain weight or are you trying to gain muscle? Because gaining weight just means being heavier, right? So if you want to gain weight, just wear heavier shoes, put on all your clothes, drink concrete, and you'll be heavier. But if you want to gain good quality mass, if you want to gain lean muscle mass, it's going to take a stress and it's going to take a good, something that's going to aid your recovery. And that means good food quality. So it's not just about consuming to get heavier, which is people often forget that. And it's very difficult to eat that much food that's going to support your recovery. So the magic number really is on your training days, that what I would advise to people who are trying to gain muscle mass, aim to eat within about 500 calories of a surplus. So let's say, for example, your body needs 2,000 calories a day to maintain its body weight, not go up, not go down, not lose weight, not gain weight. When you're trying to gain muscle mass, try and eat about 500 calories in a surplus each day on your lifting days, and on your non-lifting days, eat towards maintenance. So eat your 2,000 calories. On your lifting days, get closer to eating maybe 2,500 calories, and make sure those extra 500 calories come from quality food. So don't just think you've got 500 calories worth of Snickers ice cream to eat, because you don't. It's not going to aid your recovery. It's not going to help your muscles grow from the stress you've put on them in the gym. You need to be eating it from good quality proteins, meats, vegetables, some whole grains, that kind of stuff. All right. So we'll move on to the next one. So this is where we're going to spend a good amount of our time today. It's talking about fat loss. So the reason we talk about fat loss is that because actually gaining muscle mass is it's pretty hard to do. And as we get older, it only gets harder. So everybody, I've heard the saying before, obviously working with clients in the gym, but like, hey, we've all got abs. It's under there somewhere. Yeah, we do all have abs. And if most of the time from an aesthetic standpoint, unless our goal is performance-based, where we need to get much stronger to lift a particular weight, losing weight is actually a little bit easier. The process by losing weight is actually a little bit easier and quicker than it is to gain muscle mass. Okay, so gaining muscle mass is a pretty slow incremental growth. Gaining weight, you can do it probably a little more steadily for a little bit longer, and the increments of change are probably a little bit bigger as well. So that's why we'll spend more time on this today, because lots of people think that they want to gain weight, they want to gain muscle mass. It's a lot harder for them to do that. So instead, to achieve their goal of like their aesthetic goal, is likely just easier for them to drop body fat, to reveal what's underneath, than it is for them to try and push out muscle from underneath their body fat, right? So the question I was asked here is, what's the easiest diet to do for fat loss? And at first I thought this was a joke, and then I realized actually it's not a joke, it's a completely reasonable question. And I've been asked it before. So my first response was to laugh and said that fat loss is rarely easy. You know, if you've ever tried to lose weight in the past, you know that it's pretty difficult and it takes some time. Weight loss and fat loss are often misinterpreted and routinely misrepresented. So when people say weight loss, they're just looking to get lighter on the scale. Well, as I said earlier on, if you want to get heavier on the scale, just wear all your clothes and drink concrete and you'll be fine, you'll be heavier. If you want to weigh less on the scale, just take all your clothes off, drink less water, and you'll probably weigh a little bit less. It's actually more about thinking about it's not fat loss necessarily that I'm trying to get rid of, but it's fat usage, right? How am I trying to use my fat? Or how am I trying to use it in a way that it doesn't come back, and use it in a way that doesn't just represent how much I weigh on the scale, but what I can actually do now I've got rid of excess fat. Okay, so getting lighter on the scale can happen through a number of different things. So like water fluctuation or dehydration or excess hydration, sodium consumption, menstruation, hard training sessions. Well, I'll probably weigh a little bit more the day after I train really hard, because my body's just holding on to nutrients and water a little bit more to aid for its recovery. Greater food consumption. So by greater food consumption, I don't just mean calorie consumption. I mean, like, if I eat 2 bags of spinach, there's not that many calories in that, but it weighs X amount. So I weigh 2 bags of spinach more when I weigh myself next, right? So it's not just about calorie consumption, it's about actual total mass of food consumed. So fat loss, on the other hand, is a direct result of us using energy. So when we lose fat, we have in fact used it to power a particular function, right? So there's a difference between fat loss and weight loss. Weight loss, we can play with our body weight in lots of different ways, but fat loss is it's categoric. Fat loss is a direct result of using energy to power a bodily function, okay? So one of the ways that I usually try and describe this to people is to try and reframe what we think about as fat loss. So when we say fat loss, try and think of it more as fat use, all right? Loss defines something like this feeling of longing or being without something, right? And we likely don't long to have our fat back once we've used it. Instead, the challenge is to shift the mindset more towards that, like view fat loss as fat usage. I've used that fat to power a function, then that function has been to get stronger, to do exercise, because they're the things that are going to create my calorie deficit that is going to keep me in a kind of good cycle of moving forward and continuing to better my health. So fat loss continued. So what's the easiest diet to do for fat loss? Well, there is no one perfect or easiest diet for fat loss or for losing fat or for fat usage, let's say. Most every diet spins kind of a bit of a magic dust or a magic reason as to why it works more than another does. But really there are 3 simple and scientific reasons given that make any fat loss diet or any diet work. There's 3 main reasons, and it's typically fewer calories, less junk food, more whole foods. They're the things that go into it. But the main thing is that every single diet, if it is to work, if you are to lose body fat, if you are to create if you are to lose weight, it will come from creating a calorie deficit. So it doesn't matter whether it's intermittent fasting, vegetarian, keto, Weight Watchers, zone, literally any diet does those 3 things, okay? It lowers your calories, creating a calorie deficit. It reduces your junk food, because that's a really easy way to lower your total amount of calories, is to cut out refined junk food. And it increases whole foods. So it removes foods that are really calorie dense and nutrient sparse, and it replaces them with nutrient dense, calorie sparse options. Okay, and that's how we get to that main goal of fewer total calories. So there is be under no illusion that there's any other science around it other than that. If you want to lose weight, you need to create a calorie deficit. The end. Okay. Now, depending on the person to person, you can choose whichever way you want to do that through any of those diets, but don't be drawn into the fact that it sounds magic, because it isn't magic, right? But so depending on the one that you want to select it based off your lifestyle, and just select it based off the one that you feel like you can maintain. So some people do really well with intermittent fasting because they wake up in the morning, they don't really desire hunger, so they don't really desire food, they're not that hungry, and then they get to the middle of the day and then they go to bed at 10 o'clock at night. So in between 10 and 12 is when they get to eat. And now all that does is just it narrows their window of eating, right? So intermittent fasting has a couple of other kind of tertiary, let's say, effects that could be positive for people. But the main thing is the reason it causes fat loss is because it narrows the window by which you can consume calories. So you can't eat that many calories in 10 hours. You can't eat as many calories in 10 hours as you can in 16. Okay? That is the main reason. That is why that happens. So yeah, the tertiary aspects of things, like some people feel a little bit better. They feel a bit icky when they eat carbs, or they don't have a great response to carbs. I don't have a great response to things like pasta. I don't have a great response to things like oats. So I try and stay away from those, but I'm not vilifying carbohydrates, just saying I don't deal well with those 2 forms of carbohydrates, because I can eat bread until the cows come home. You want to watch me crush rice and potatoes? No problems. And they're basically the same. They are the same macronutrient. It's just some of them make me feel a little bit better than another. So no one particular macronutrient will make you fat or not fat. Over-consuming a macronutrient, if you have a tendency to want to over-consume a macronutrient, then that in and of itself creates a calorie surplus, and then you'll be far more likely to gain weight. So no one macronutrient makes us fat. Over-consuming any of these will put you into an energy or a calorie surplus that will turn to fat. regardless of whether it applies to apples or Pop-Tarts. It doesn't matter. Like if you overconsume them, you'll gain weight. Having said that, it's very difficult to overconsume apples. Pop-Tarts, on the other hand, are hyper palatable, and you could absolutely smash them until the cows come home. At least I could. So the key is to finding which version of creating a calorie deficit works for you. Are you an intermittent fasting person? Are you a keto person? Are you a Weight Watchers person? Whatever it might be. And that takes some trial and error. So some people feel better on intermittent fasting, like I said, because it narrows the window. And they notice maybe an increase in energy and focus. That's great. They're the tertiary the bits around the outside that are not the main reasons to do a particular diet, but they definitely help because they make it maybe a little bit more palatable and they make it a little bit more long-term or long-standing. Some people note that if they eat fewer carbs and higher fat, it helps them lose weight. Remember, it's not the lack of carbs that makes this happen. It's the overall lower calories consumed because they're likely cutting out hyperpalatable foods. So some people enjoy doing Weight Watchers because in Weight Watchers, less points are attributed to lower calorie foods and more points are attributed to higher calorie foods. Typically, higher calorie foods are things more processed, are things, are junk foods. So by lowering the reason by which you would eat them, you will lower your total amount of calories, right? But it's just a way to gamify for us to kind of find a fun way for us to eat less calories. But the same thing is we're going to eat less calories, all right? So you can lose weight by counting calories and you can lose weight by not counting calories. But calories always count. We put that one on a t-shirt. You can lose weight by counting calories and you can lose weight by not counting calories, but calories always count. So move on from the next one. Still sticking on the same one here. And I told you we were going to kind of beat this one to death. So hyperpalatable foods are often more processed, super tasty, and a mixture of all three macronutrients. So I play this one out in your head. Bread in and of itself is not that super tasty. Dry bread. It's not super appealing. But if you cover it in peanut butter and jam, which is fat and some protein and sugar, which is more carbs, you can see how that might be hyperpalatable. You can see how you could probably knock down 4 or 5 pieces of peanut butter and jelly and have no problem with it. But bread on its own, really difficult. Peanut butter on its own, really difficult to overeat because it's so so much of the same stuff. Jam on its own, I challenge anybody to just eat a pot of jam. Like you're not going to do that too many times. Put those 3 things together, however, and then that's what becomes a little bit wicked, right? So no carbohydrates or fat on their own or protein on their own are going to make, they're not inherently bad foods. But when we mix them together and we make them hyperpalatable, we're far more likely to overconsume them. So the important thing to remember then is that not all calories are created equal. So 100 grams of rice and 100 grams of Pop-Tart are both carbohydrates. They're both majority carbohydrates, let's say. But the quality of those carbohydrates is very different. So there's lots of different diets. Some people eat carbs, some people don't eat carbs. But if you let's say that we lower our amount of carbs by 20%. But in that time, we also get rid of we also get rid of all the Pop-Tarts that we eat. Well, it's likely not the carbohydrates that we've lowered. It's likely the fact that we've got rid of carbohydrates. So we've got rid of the Pop-Tarts. So the quality of the digestion, the insulin response, the efficiency of how your body uses those different carbohydrates, the rate of energy release, the fiber levels, the nutrient and calorie density is completely different. So between rice and Pop-Tarts, right? So it isn't all about just carbs being good or bad. Carbs are very, very useful. They're the body's preferred energy system. Body's preferred source of energy. I did put a little diagram up here. So for those of you who can see the slides, that's the human stomach. That's 100 grams. The green is 100 grams worth of rice, which is a large amount with calories spread out through it. And the yellow is supposed to signify 100 calories worth of Pop-Tart, which is not that much of a large surface area with 100 grams spread out through it. Now the calories in those are ultimately the same, but look how they fit into the human stomach a little bit different. Look how they fit into the system a little bit different. So Pop-Tart probably not going to satiate you that much, but the rice might satiate you a little bit more. And then when we add in the quality of digestion, insulin response, all those other things that I just mentioned, it makes rice far more useful, but Pop-Tarts are delicious. that's the balance that we have to find. If I want really quick energy, maybe I'll eat a Pop-Tart, but very rarely is that really the demand for me. I could probably get away with eating 45 minutes earlier and choosing a better quality macronutrient choice. Right? So we'll move on to our last little bit of talking here, and we're going to kind of unpack a little bit more of the mainstream diet. So the main question that I was asked by one of our members was, what's the deal with intermittent fasting and keto? And we recently talked about it a little bit, or we talked about it maybe 10 minutes ago. So I'm going to go out on a limb here, which means I'm probably going to get torn to pieces by some lunatic on the internet. But the biggest benefit of keto is that it gives us a very simple structure to follow. Eat less carbs, or don't eat carbs. 95% of the benefits of keto comes from that main thing. All right. So by saying, hey, eat less carbohydrates, if you've lived in this world for the last however many years, you've consumed carbohydrates. Now somebody is taking that away from you. You're going to find it very hard to consume the same amount of calories without a third of your options. So just like I said a minute ago, bread, delicious in and of itself, but not hyper palatable. But when you put fat and protein, which are the things that are demanded from keto, or that you can eat on keto, when you put them on bread, they become bloody amazing. Any of you that have ever had meatballs and spaghetti together, like spaghetti on its own, not that good. Meatballs on their own, you're not going to be able to eat that many. Put them together and cover them in cheese, watch me go. Right? So it's the fat, the protein, and the carbohydrates that we've all mixed together that makes it hyper palatable. So no one food, again, I can't say this enough, no one food is going to make you fat, but the combination of those foods together and how they're engineered makes them hyper palatable and far more likely to overeat. So that's bearing that in mind. So I'm going out on a limb and saying that the main benefit of something like keto or intermittent fasting for that matter is that it gives you a very simple structure. Don't eat carbs, or only eat in between 1 and 7. Very simple structure, which ultimately limits the amount of calories that you can consume, leading to a calorie deficit, leading to weight loss, period. So as a side note, anytime we limit carbohydrates, which is always, this is something to bear in mind about any time we limit carbohydrates, that we initially, one of the biggest kind of draws towards keto is that people lose a lot of weight very quickly. Most of that is water weight, and it's because when we eat less carbohydrates, we ultimately we form less glycogen, which is what binds to water and in the muscles and liver. So we keep less water in our body because we don't have any carbohydrates, any glycogen for it to bind to. So we pee it out, or we sweat it out, or we breathe it out, and then we ultimately weigh a little bit less. So maybe we'd see like a 5 to 10 pound weight loss in the first week. But if and when you start eating carbohydrates again, and you'll gain weight back, right? Because you can't not, like, if you want to live a life devoid of carbohydrates, maybe you can. Maybe that's, good for you, and that's fine. I'm all about it if that's somewhere where you want to be and you kind of don't really enjoy carbohydrates anyway. But if the goal of starving yourself of carbohydrates is a short-term thing, and then you're going to go right back to eating them again, it's ultimately not worth it. Because, and here's why. For some folks, there's basically, the longer we don't eat something, the more attractive it becomes when we go back to eat it again. So if you've ever not eaten carbohydrate, or if you've ever given up chocolate, the next time you go and eat chocolate, it's like a religious experience. And I'll chase a chocolate truck down the street to try and get something. It becomes, incredibly seductive. Not because sugar is addictive, but I've kind of taken myself away from that for so long that I don't really have any boundaries around it anymore. And it becomes more of a mental and a habitual thing rather than it is just sugar being the same as cocaine, which it's not addictive. And that means that we're likely going to overconsume it again because it's super, super tasty. And I've staved away from it for so long that now I'm desperate to go back to it. With intermittent fasting, some people just feel a little bit better on, when they eat a little bit less first thing in the morning. Digestively, it makes them feel a little bit better. Obviously, there are some other tertiary reasons around the outside of it, but the main reason that it feels good for people is if they get results out of it, they're far more likely to keep eating it. And with intermittent fasting, it doesn't cut out any food, so it's not cutting out any one macronutrient like carbohydrates. Still eat whatever you want. I would still advise that you eat meat, vegetables, some potatoes, some whole grains, some fruit, that kind of stuff. But it doesn't say that you can't have Snickers. It just says that you only have this very small window by which to eat Snickers. And if you overeat them, you'll still gain weight. So noticing that that is the case. So really, if the main story behind today is that there is no magic, the goal is to create a calorie deficit in the most manageable and sustainable way for you. If your goal is to lose body fat, or if your goal is to burn body fat, you know, so there are seldom few drawbacks to the keto diet. This is the last thing I was going to say. But remembering that when you stay away from food, it becomes super seductive at the end of it. So, and that kind of can put us in a bit of a cycle of wanting more food, having less food, and then binging on that food again, which is never a good place to be. So bear that in mind. And this will take, if you're looking to work out which dietary regimen is the best for you, and you are the kind of person that needs some structure, that really enjoys like a definitive structure, like don't eat carbs or only eat in between this window and this window, that's fine. That can absolutely work for you. First things first, be under no illusion that there's magic, because it's not. And do something that, don't force yourself into a square peg into a round hole. If it doesn't work, like if you feel like you're making yourself bloody miserable, I'm okay with people suffering a little bit to get something of what they want. But if it's going to kick back at the end of the day and it's going to make you rebound and go and overconsume the things that you have been starving yourself, or you've kind of been avoiding, it's only going to help you yo-yo diet and kind of go back and gain a little bit more weight each time that you do that. Okay, so that's all I had for today. And there was a lot of information in there. Obviously, popularized diets is hours and hours of talking as one subject matter. Gaining muscle, we could talk about that all day. Losing fat, all we ever seem to do is talk about losing fat. So we could talk about it all day, but these were the things that I selected from the questions that I got from people. So hopefully you found that useful. If there's any questions that you have about any of that and we want to unpack it a little bit more, you can DM me on Instagram. You can respond via YouTube if you watch this video on YouTube, and send me a private message or put something in the comments there. Or you can email me at jay@ethosfit, which is JAY@ethosfit, ETHOSFIT.com. Any of those things, if you want to talk about it a little bit further, that's absolutely fine as well. But all of this will now be available via a video link. I'll put it out on Instagram, and you can kind of watch it again later on and unpack it a little bit farther, and do some other research on it. I've touched on some of the more not superficial, but I've touched on some of the base layers. The coach in me always says it depends, and it does depend. It does depend on the person to person. The vast majority, like we're making some blanket statements here, but the vast majority of the people are pretty similar. And especially that's what is the case when it comes to losing weight or gaining weight, or any of the scientific functions that go on inside the human body. Most people are exactly the same. Most of us, we're not that special, unfortunately, fall right in the middle of that bell curve. And there's some people on this end of the extreme, some people over here, but most of us square in the middle. So have a wonderful day. Let me know if you need anything, and I will see you all very soon.